show yourself down. Thank you. So coming up next, so one of the things that is this magic pixie dust that happens when you release something as open source is that it automatically is more secure. I really just mean exactly the opposite. What we've put together is a panel to talk about really what security means in the enterprise blockchain context. Partly what we're doing at Hyperledger to try to manifest that as well. Make sure that it's not just a serendipitous thing that we happily arrive at, but something we actually focus on and make as a core principle. To that extent, one of my first hires at Hyperledger has been David Huseby. David is our security maven, which is kind of like CISO if we were actually an enterprise. But David's job is to audit our development processes, audit our activities as an open source community, and make sure that we are delivering software that is as secure as we can make it, presuming that no software is ever 100% secure. The most important thing is when a vulnerability is found, to be able to respond and address that and push that out. And then secondly, to kind of think about security as it relates to identity, as it relates to permissioning, and the rest of that. So I'd like to invite the rest of the panel up here as well, Jeff and Justin. And do we have Andre and Drummond in the room too?
Drummond's there.
Okay, oh, and Andre, okay. Great. Great, well, I will turn it over to you guys. Why don't I turn it over to you? Thanks.
All right, as my panel gets up here.
He was right to call us out about that.
As Brian was saying, with open source, we used to sell it all the time as lots of eyes make software more secure. And to a certain extent, that is true. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be applying best practices at all levels that we've learned both in closed source and open source processes. And I'm happy to be joined with some quite interesting folks that I've met lately. They have
what an unqualified critique there.
Literally some of the smartest people I know. They're all very, very ambitious in their projects that they're doing. And as you'll see as we get through this conversation, blockchain and open source has opened up a world of possibility when it comes to tackling some of the largest and most pervasive problems that we still face today. So with that, let me go around the room here and have you guys introduce yourselves and give us just a little bit about what your project is about.
Sure. So I'm Justin Newton. I'm the founder and CEO of NetKey. I spent a little more than 20 years building tech startups and tech organizations, including the last 4 have gone to IPO. Here at NetKey, we're focused on solving challenges to help with the commercialization and mass market adoption of blockchain technology. And the primary product that we provide is doing validated digital identity for risk and compliance purposes, both validating it and sharing it.
Drummond Reed, I'm Chief Trust Officer of a company called Evernym that helped develop the original code base that was then contributed to the Sovereign Foundation to power the Sovereign is a global public utility for self-sovereign identity. And the Sovereign Foundation subsequently joined Hyperledger in December and then contributed to that code base, and it's now Project Indy inside Hyperledger.
That's
and
great.
I chair the Trust Framework Working Group of the Sovereign Foundation, so we're building a trust framework for that network as well as the code.
I'm Jeff Garzik, the founder and co-founder and CEO of Block. We provide enterprise-grade blockchain infrastructure. Very specifically, came from a Red Hat open source background. If many of you have Android in your pocket, you're running some of my code. I apologize if you have any problems with that. And what we do is we provide Bitcoin and Ethereum compatible nodes, wallets, analytics, SDKs and libraries, et cetera, that let you deploy a Bitcoin compatible, Ethereum compatible, Hyperledger compatible blockchain.
Very good. Astianas Kanakakis, co-founder and CEO of Norblock. At Norblock, essentially, we do regulatory applications for financial institutions on blockchains. And we released last month our KYC platform. So essentially, know your customer application for financial institutions. So actually, identity is at the core of what we're working on.
My name is Andre Boyson, and I'm with a company in Toronto called the SecureKey. We do digital identity and authentication for consumers in Canada. We run the largest commercial service of its kind in Canada, which is called the SecureKey Concierge Network. It's been running since 2012. That allows Canadians to use their bank account to get to government. And so what we're doing now is building on the success of that network to add identity to it so Canadians can use trusted identity information for the relationships they have in their life, like their bank, their telco, and their government, to get access to the services they want online. And we're also a member of the Hyperledger project with IBM. And like Sovereign, we've been contributing new code to make this identity based on blockchain work.
Thanks, guys. So something interesting came out of this. All of you had mentioned identity as a key piece of all of your solutions. As you guys know, with blockchain, there's a tendency to put a lot of stuff in the chain that is not necessarily should be there, right? As we're learning, and specifically in the realm of identity, and with all the regulations around know your customers and handling people's private information and things like that. Can you talk about how security and privacy has shaped the designs and how you've deployed blockchains in particular to solve their problem?
Yeah, I mean, in our case, the privacy and security of the communication of identity information was actually one of the core tenets of our product when we designed it. And from that perspective, we actually try and keep identity and the elements related and tied to identity off the chain itself, which is true with most of the self-sovereign solutions that are being built as well. As most of the people in the room would understand, when you write something to a blockchain, the thing that is protecting it, right, from a confidentiality perspective is encryption. And as we also all know, all encryption eventually fails, whether it's because CPUs got faster or because someone wrote a library with a semicolon or a parenthesis in the wrong place. And so, by keeping identity information off-chain, exchanging it at the application level, and ensuring that only the counterparties ever have access to that information, you're able to help ensure confidentiality and privacy.
Huge +1 to that. So with Sovereign, because we're designing a global public utility, we had to really do privacy by design from the ground up. And so there are really three things that we built into the Sovereign Trust framework. And the first one is exactly what Justin just said, that no private data goes on the ledger. It's an identifier, public keys, endpoints for that offline, we call it an agent, that's going to do the peer-to-peer interaction. Exactly. Second principle was that by default, the identifiers that go on Sovereign for personal identity are pairwise unique. You don't have one DID, decentralized identifier. You have as many as you need to keep all of your relationships contextually separate. And the third one was that the offline exchange not only can be encrypted between any two, that peer-to-peer interactions because you have the public key, but you can now use zero-knowledge proofs to share that data so you can get data minimization built into the architecture.
Yeah, I think it's almost paradoxical where you have, on the one hand, Apple and Samsung say they don't need to see, they really don't want to reveal their transactions to their competitor. Apple doesn't want to reveal to Samsung what they're doing. Samsung doesn't want to reveal to Apple. So you need privacy. Privacy is an absolute requirement. But as many of you know, the largest financial institutions in the world, AML, KYC, the Patriot Act, et cetera, there is the need to ensure that there's bad actors are detected. There are compliance needs at big banks. There are risk needs at big banks. CSOs need to be happy at big banks. And so really the current technology with this self-sovereign identity is creating a marriage of the two where you have a private lower layer, that's the blockchain, and as was just mentioned, that all the personal information is off the blockchain, but it secures your information. And then as a second level, that's where the identity information comes in, whether it's from a self-sovereign passport or signing oracles, which check your identity, et cetera. And so I really think that, sort of disagreeing with my opening statement intentionally, it's not paradoxical at all in that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have privacy on the blockchain, and with these new self-sovereign technologies, we can have strong, secure identity as well.
So it's actually very much mirror your arguments here, especially in the technological perspective. There's actually another element, which is actually the legal perspective. So when we first we have one of the biggest law firms in Scandinavia advising us. And when we first went with our solution, they said, actually, you cannot put any personal information on the blockchain. Encoded data or plain data, the law is not very clear on that. If someone is not, in our case, a customer of the bank, and that bank holds even encoded information for that customer, that cannot happen. So essentially, the off-chain storage becomes very much a legal prerequisite as well as we see technological.
I guess a clean sweep on PII and the blockchain, we all have violent agreement. That's a bad idea.
Bad idea.
So I'm not going to spend time there. But from our point of view, what blockchain is doing, it gives us three very important things. There's two elements of privacy. I'll talk about that. It's important for data integrity. I'll talk about what that means. And then the third thing is resiliency. On the privacy front, one of the problems is today when I use documents to do things in person, often my documents over-answer questions. When I use my driver's license, often it's giving more data away than it really needs to. When I'm getting on the airplane, they don't really need my address as an example.
So you're talking about selective disclosure, right?
Right, so we need to minimize, and so selective disclosure, we call it data privacy mediation. So the idea that we can actually minimize the data that's being sent based on the context of what's being done. So you don't have to play go fish with the user. Can I have your phone number? No, right? Like you don't want to get into this kind of dialogue with the user. So privacy mediation solves that. So that's the first privacy aspect. The second is we invented this idea back in 2008, 2009 of triple blind privacy for authentication. So the idea was if I was going to use my bank account to get to government, the bank should not see my online destination. The government in its place should know I came from TD Bank or Royal Bank, and our company, which operates the network, we don't know who you are. So what that said, not the bank, not the government, not SecureKey, got a complete picture of the user journey. And what we fussed with for a long time is actually how to solve this for identity. As soon as you start getting into attributes, there's a lot more information in there, and it's harder to stay blind. And so we knew how to do triple blind with identity with PKI, and technically feasible, but it was going to be a bit of an operational hairball. And so what blockchain is doing for us is giving us an easy way to implement blinding. So when I share my bank information with my carrier as an example, the bank doesn't get to see who I shared it with. And the carrier in its place knows it came from a tier 1 bank as an example, but not which one. And our company, we operate the network, we can't see their data at rest or in motion. So now we have triple blind identity. So that's the first thing. It gives us amazing privacy. The second thing is integrity. One of the biggest challenges is today is when I share my documents, like I use my TD Bank statement to prove I live at my address because I want a healthcare benefit. One of the challenges with that is it's giving away too much data is one problem. But the second problem is that the destination service can't tell if I photoshopped the document. And so there's no data integrity. So now we can use blockchain to solve that by putting a hash. The originator of the data puts a hash of the data in the blockchain. Now we get data integrity. Same thing for the bank in its use case. Like we're asking somebody in New York to look at an Ontario driver's license and say, nice hologram, it must be a real document. Like that's the extent of security today. So we can solve this problem with data integrity. And the third thing that blockchain gives for us in our network is resiliency. So we saw the denial of service attack that happened on the East Coast not so recently. And so we're seeing, again, these denial of service attacks where we're seeing botnets take over large networks. And so what blockchain gives us is the ability to have all the endpoints have their own copy of the ledger. So if you want to take down the network, you got to take down all the banks and all the telcos and all the governments at the same time. So it's a much harder denial of service problem. So that's what blockchain does for us.
Great. All of you had mentioned this off-chain storage capability or need. It's specifically with like Evernym, there's going to be a need for that data to be exposed to other services, to actually be able to go and do a verifiable claim or to validate a verifiable claim that, you know, like when I want to go and have a beer, they need to know that I'm 21, right, for instance. How do you see, or what kind of solutions have you developed that allow your projects to expose this data in a way that outside parties would be able to verify it without necessarily going through you, right? Is there a need for like set of standards, interoperability? Like how do you do off-chain attribute exchange and validation and all that kind of thing? I mean, do you see, I mean, we just saw yesterday the Distributed Identity Foundation started up, and they're trying to establish standards for DIDs and things like that. I mean, what do you see in the need, like as needs that maybe we aren't meeting right now, and how is that affecting your design for off-chain storage?
Want me to start with that?
Yeah, why not, Jerome?
So that is Dave, you're absolutely right. One of the key reasons Decentralized Identity Foundation was starting up was when you have a network now where you have self-sovereign identities, they're able to exchange verifiable claims. Now the interoperability and the semantics become hugely important, right? I mean, we standardized the paper, well, actually, I'll use a great example. Driver's licenses in the US, right? Not standardized at all, right? It's huge business for Morpho Trust because there's 50 different ways to do it. So if we're going to get to interoperable credentials, first of all, we need a standard protocol for actually exchanging them. That's what the W3C just announced a working group for called verifiable claims. So still early days, but there's actually 4.5 years of work that's gone into establishing that protocol. Then we're going to need standard claims. Well, one of the unique things that blockchain technology brings for that is the schema definition gets posted to the blockchain. You now have an immutable long-term reference to the schema definition that many others can then use. This is exactly, in Sovereign, that's what we're saying, is claim definition is the first thing that gets published. The issuer of claims then publishes their keys to issue that claim, but any other issuer can say, I'm going to issue claims with that definition. They publish their own claims. The last part of it that is, I think, really exciting is how do you revoke claims, right? Turns out the blockchain technology solves one of the long-standing problems. How can you have revocable claims? And that's, you don't put a revocation list out there on the blockchain. That would be a really bad idea. But with zero-knowledge proof technology, you can put what's called a cryptographic accumulator. And go read the Wikipedia article, cryptographic accumulator, because it's rocket science. But it's really cool because basically there's a number there, and anyone that has a proof of a claim can prove I still have a valid claim. And when that number changes and I can't no longer do that proof, my credential's been revoked.
That's a cool idea in theory, but right now we don't have a way of knowing if zero-knowledge proofs are lying to us. Right? And that's actually one of the challenges that comes up with a lot of the different pieces of the stack today, whether it's standards that don't exist, secure storage containers that aren't yet really secure, and other pieces of the architecture that aren't yet complete. There's a lot of promise in what's being built here, and it's clear that the directions that these are moving in are the way that identity should be going in the future. But I think there's a lot of places along the way where the individual pieces that need to be constructed in order to complete that system are still, either development works in process, but actually more than that, they're actually design works in process today, right? Where the standards are still being created. Zero-knowledge proofs are still kind of a science project, not really a engineering project at this point. Data storage containers, today we don't have a way to protect them from being weaponized by the person who holds them. And other pieces where the technology, the theory has outrun the current state of technology.
Yeah, one of the things that hasn't been mentioned so far is trust and trust shifting. For example, the canonical example I use is SEC accredited investor validation, where if I want to receive some investment from an accredited investor, they have to prove that they are indeed an accredited investor. And that may involve them turning over tax documents, turning over a lot of sensitive personal information that they would rather not provide to 10 funds or startups or et cetera. And these claims allow you to say, well, this firm checked that this person is an accredited investor, put a digital stamp on that, and if I trust that authority who checked that accredited investor PII, then I can say, yes, you are indeed an accredited investor without ever seeing their personal information. So this preserves the investor's privacy, and the investor is not giving out their personal information to 10, 20, 30 people. But, and this is where blockchain itself really comes in, is the word trust shifting. Instead of trusting these direct relationships, you're trusting this new technology. And so I really think that, and that sort of dovetails the zero-knowledge proofs argument of there's a lot of trust hurdles in some of this new technology before you can trust an authority to say, yes, he's over 21 and he can go and drink some alcohol. Yes, he's an accredited investor. He can invest in that company.
And as part of the trust shifting, liability shifting.
Absolutely.
Who owns the liability in the case that the ID was fraudulent? Is it the person that's trusting the attestation, the person that made it? If the person made it, but made it under less risky conditions, you know, those conditions changed when someone else uses it? How does that liability shift?
So actually, this is a very big problem. The physical world basically translating to the digital world, and basically who makes that connection, how trustworthy he or she is, and at the same time, how much willing they are to reveal that they have a relationship. So for example, you're an investor that basically comes to you and they don't want to reveal all the information, but they have a stamp, let's say, of approval by JP Morgan. Does JP Morgan want you to know that they're their customer or that they've checked his information? So it's quite complex, the whole translation of the physical into digital world. And the revocation argument, it's particularly important. In Europe, we have a new legislation coming into play next year, GDPR, in May. GDPR, basically, it's a data protection law. It stipulates that if you actually don't follow that law, it's 2 to 4% of your global revenues as a fine. And it's not debatable, that's what it is. Up to now, I've met many banks that, not openly, but between the lines, they tell us that I can afford actually not to follow the legal regulation because I can pay for the fine. So it's not a big problem. It costs me so much more to actually follow the regulation. So the revocation is a problem. Blockchain is not, it's an amazing technology, but it's not exactly built for revocation. We did an effort, our lead developer published a white paper on, let's say, secure deletion on blockchain, but it's just such an oxymoron. Deletion on blockchain. It's just an immutable ledger suddenly becomes mutable. So this is actually quite a challenge for identity, security, and privacy.
I'd like to touch on the liability idea for a moment and then bring it back to decentralized ID. One of the challenges with this liability model thing is if we don't get the thing right, it's going to fall on its sword. And what we recognize today, like the way real identity works, is that it's a zero liability model. When the bank consumes the state driver's license to do an identity proofing, they have zero recourse back in the state if they got it wrong. And when I take my bank statement over to the healthcare organization to prove where I live, same thing there. The healthcare organization has zero recourse back on the bank. In fact, the bank never knew I was going to do that in the first place.
So it's like a safe harbor almost, right?
Well, so that's just the way the world works today.
Yeah.
And so I think as we get to a digital world, we actually kind of want to copy that model. We had this challenge when we launched the model in Canada with the banks and the government. The original RFP called for the ability for the government to sue in the case the bank got it wrong. And we were able to persuade them that, although they think that's what they want, that's actually not what they want. And this is why. When you look at the mortgage-backed fiasco that happened in 2008 or so, that happened for a very particular reason. When banks underwrote loans, they always carried the risk forever. So they were very careful when they wrote the loan because they owned the risk forever. As soon as we had securitization, the bank stopped caring about the loans. And then all care left the system. And so what we found out was that basically people were relying on their right to sue to keep the system safe. And what that developed was a lazy RP. They didn't care. And so we don't want to introduce that kind of behavior as we get to identity. So when we look at the fact that the real world already has zero recourse model, and when we talked to the government of Canada, the truth was the bank is actually doing the government a favor because this is going to take their costs down. And it's also going to increase their assurance that the customer is really the customer. So we're going to have a happier customer, take your costs down, and we're going to give you a higher assurance, and you have the right to sue too? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so the solve we came to was this. Look, level 2 credentials have level 2 limitations. They're not perfect. It doesn't matter if the bank's operating a level 2 or the government's operating level 2. They are not perfect. The truth is the bank's going to be better at it simply because they have higher velocity with their customers. So the bank's going to do a better job no matter what. So the model we got to in Canada says, provided the bank acted in good faith, there is no recourse at all. And so that's actually how we launched the model in Canada. And I think that model will follow as we get to identity because we want destination services to be careful when they bind a credential to an identity. We do not want them relying on their right to sue to keep the system safe. So that's a pragmatic view of how we take care of liability. Destination has the liability today, and they're going to have it in the future. It's always going to be their risk. So if we want to keep a low-cost system, we keep it that way. And for those who have risk, they can actually just have an insurer step in as last resort to cover your risk for those organizations that feel they need that. So the next thing I want to do is bring it back to this decentralized identity foundation idea. I think it's actually quite important. One of the challenges is today that we have a lot of authentication noise and identity noise. Every web service is doing their own thing. And this is manifesting as noise in user space, and that's what we've done. We've normalized the noise for the user. Users have no idea what makes sense and what doesn't. This week, I'm getting like email password resets. The next week, I get an SMS message. Then I'm doing a retina scan. Then it's a selfie. And so users have no idea what makes sense anymore. And so when we get a rogue service coming out there saying, hey, check out what you look like compared to this other star, and you think you're doing this vanity thing, when in reality, it's a man-in-the-middle redirection on a selfie check. Right? Users don't know what they're saying yes to anymore. So we've normalized the noise. So what's cool about the payment networks is that the way we pay for stuff in the last 70 years has barely changed at all. It started with card and signature, and now we're chip and pin. I'm talking about in person, not online, just in person. And so this user ritual, what's interesting about it is the payment networks, Visa, Amex, MasterCard, Discover, have the same payment ritual across the globe. And that's what's allowed the payment networks to scale. What we're lacking today is a user and identity access ritual that's consistent across these things. So this needs to be driven by standards, and we need to hide the security away from the users. My dad is never going to be doing blockchain anything, ever, right? So we need to hide all of this complexity away from the users, and that's what we've done with payment cards. Users do not get alerts every week. Do this with your payment card, do this, and don't do that. Yet every week we're shoving out a new email message to our customers. This is a new internet drill for this week. Make sure you do this. So we've got to hide this all away from the users, which brings us back to the Distributed Identity Foundation. We need to do this based on standards. One of the first things we need to standardize is on a user ritual that we can all agree on. And the second thing is we make sure we have a universal namespace. So we have interop between all the payment brands. We need to get that with identity too. And so that's why this element of standards is so important.
Yeah, that's where I was getting at with the off-chain storage and attribute exchange. That's going to have to be standards driven, right? That's the only way that all these systems are going to interoperate. Sounds like you're volunteering to drive the standardization process.
We definitely have an opinion on it. We want to share our point of view, but it's not the only one. There's lots of different ideas. Like I'm a big fan of what Sovereign is doing for the 2.5 billion people in the world that don't have any identity at all. This is going to be world transformational. Yeah. But I don't think it's going to be the only thing in the end. So there's going to be more. We have more than one payment brand. We'll have more than one identity scheme. And so these things need to have interop. And so we for sure want to have it. I think what Evernym is doing and the Sovereign ID Foundation is also very cool. And there's other organizations that will come to the party as well.
Interesting. So I've been sitting here trying to decide on where we're going to take this next. SDNX, you mentioned GDPR. We could probably talk forever on that one. But you just mentioned the rest of the world, right? This identity potentially transforming basically how all humans interact with societal systems and private businesses. I think I'm going to go in that direction because from my background, I've spent a lot of time working with human rights organizations and dealing with anonymity and anti-surveillance and tracking online and things like that. I think one of the big questions that I get a lot is, great, we're going to put identity in a blockchain or this global utility. How does that not instantly become the global registry of all citizens so that we know exactly what they're doing all the time and we can control them? How do we design these systems such that we are self-sovereign, right, in the sense that we can control our data within some regulatory framework like GDPR? But how do we also preserve the ability to operate anonymously? Because for me, I cherish being able to go down to the corner store and buy something with cash. I'm weird. I love it when I can do that because I get so tired when people are just like, no, you need to have a credit card to prove your identity and all this stuff. I'm like, no, cash, legal tender. You're supposed to be able to take this, right? How do we build these digital systems that still provide for that ability? Like, have you considered this?
Yeah, maybe I'll just start. I just want to add one comment before we get into it.
Sure.
Just one thing that needs to be said at the outset. What I've learned in this space since I've been in it, there's two things about identity that are really, really important. One thing is that we need identity is sovereign. Every country wants to kind of know how the scheme works and want to be able to hold the players that are operating this scheme accountable. Mm-hmm. So we need a nation-based sovereignty so that governments can hold organizations to account, because that's where our foundation of law is around the world. So that's where accountability is going to come. And the second thing is that identity is very cultural. What works in country one will not work necessarily in country two. And so all of us, like in G20 countries, really come with this from a very strong privacy point of view. And that is kind of fundamental. We need that actually to make this work at scale. But in other countries, they actually have a more, I'm not sure what the right word is, but there's more trust. When you look at the Estonia example as an example, they're more about transparency than privacy.
Sorry, what example?
Estonia.
Oh, Estonia, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so in the Estonia use case, they have privacy, but privacy isn't like the top of the pillar. It's in there, but it's not the number one thing. They have this other balancing force, which is transparency. And so if a law officer does a search on my vehicle, I'm entitled to go ask the officer why he did that, right? So you have this opposite model, and that's a cultural thing because of their lineage of being, leaving Russia and then having nothing and having to start a country basically on reliance on each other. So there's a very strong sense of patriotism and trust in that society. So that's what works there. And so we need to be able to tailor what works in countries, but still have some foundational principles that carry across.
It's definitely interesting. I guess my main concern would be that specifically we're seeing projects like the Digital Inclusion Project where they're rushing to try to bootstrap identity for a lot of the migrants in the world and who come from places that don't have systems that can verify their identity. I just hope that we're not building a system that is robbing those people of future anonymity, right? Like those of us who are fortunate enough to grow up in a society, like you said, the G20 countries that have privacy as part of our fabric and our legal system and all that stuff, we are bringing that privacy with us into this identity system. But these people who are on the move, who are going to, hi, I'm from the government, I'm here to help, and they're going to immediately get your fingerprint and they're going to put you in a database, and like we're robbing them of this potential chance of being anonymous in the future, and they don't know it, right? So how do we avoid doing that? Like, you're right, identity doesn't always translate directly over to other cultures, but shouldn't we just at least establish a floor or like a ceiling, I guess, that we're not going to go over this because we don't know how it's going to manifest itself in their culture, in their new home, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
I want to jump out on that because when we were developing the Sovereign Trust Framework, and it's a working group of the Sovereign Foundation, it's all volunteer from some of the trustees, but folks participating from all around the world, and we had to look at all the privacy requirements, and that's why, again, GDPR and the EU requirements have really sort of set the bar. One of their requirements was pseudonymity, right? Need to be able to support pseudonymity. So the thing we spent the longest time on, and if you look at the Sovereign Trust Framework, it's 26 pages. It's on the sovereign.org and the library site. 26 pages, a third of it is the definitions. Right? When you deal with identity, security, and privacy, definitions, you just have to be crystal clear about these things. The biggest diagram you'll see in there is the actual taxonomy we did of what's necessary to distinguish these different types of identity. And you'll find a diagram in there that basically says the sovereign architecture has to support anonyms and veronyms. Veronyms are easy to understand. They're the identifiers that we can all prove are associated with our legal identity. Anonyms are the exact opposite, right? There is no proof. It is the anonymity or pseudonymity that you're asking for. And we said this system must support both. And the actual requirements to support both are dramatically different, but we must support both. So I would argue that the system, at least I can say for sovereign architecture, it will support the anonymity and how the law will deal with that, an actual system where anonymity is built in as well as veronymity, we're not quite sure yet. That's why the lawyers that are there are having so much fun.
And earning a lot of money.
Yeah, I think that this is, what you're talking about is actually the reason for, one of the things we all talked about and agreed on at the beginning of the panel, which is why it's a bad idea to write that personal data even encrypted to the blockchain, and why it's important that that data gets shared at the application level between peers rather than at the blockchain level or somewhere else that allows for easy centralized surveillance. The other is it's part of the reason that I spoke earlier about the need to ensure that the secure storage containers are really secure and the data that's being hidden in them is actually hidden from your service provider for the decades that your life is going to exist. Yeah. And that the agent in front of it that's controlling access to that data is fully controlled by you, and that your service provider doesn't have like a super user access to it that allows them to get into your data, right, without your permission. And so that's one of the reasons that for me it's crucially critical that we actually get the building blocks and pieces that we're putting together here really right and well thought through, as I know the folks here are doing, before we start trying to drive mass adoption of these technologies, because in history, what I've found is when you get people onto something, it's very hard to remove them for something that's incrementally better. And so we have a real responsibility to get this right from the beginning. Subsequently, if we end up writing data to insecure places in the short to medium term, everyone whose data was stored that way is now compromised for the remainder of their life. So it's not something where, we had a problem today, we fixed it tomorrow, and the problem's gone. It's if we do it wrong, we have a problem today, we fixed it, and the problem still exists until everyone who existed before we fixed it dies.
Yes.
So it's a need for caution and to be careful and to ensure that we do things in the right way.
And I think the OPM hack, although that's obviously not blockchain, is sort of indicative of that, as is India's Aadhaar database, which stores biometrics for every single Indian citizen. But what happens if that gets compromised? How do you change your fingerprints like you change your password?
We're already seeing reports showing de-anonymization, like linkability across the sub-pieces of the Digital India database, right?
Absolutely.
I mean,
but
there was a recent report that something like 300 million of them could be identified just from a few pieces of information.
Absolutely.
That Indians would readily give you if you asked them. So.
But anonymity, I think, is really built into the whole concept, the ideal concept of self-sovereign. Self-sovereign is about taking back the power that we've never had. Traditionally, your bank, your government, et cetera, they have far more identity information about you and therefore far more control over you. And I think the whole concept of self-sovereign identity is you're in control of your data, and that extends to anonymity and pseudonymity, whereby I can say on this stage, I'm Jeff Garzik, and I go down to the local pub and people call me Ray or something like that. You can switch identities, yes. And that's part of being self-sovereign as well, is being in complete control of your reputation, your data, and how you present yourself to the world.
There is actually an element, I very much agree with all your points. Now, there is also the element that we should see how, because anonymity is great, but up to a point, and also there's some legal barriers. I cannot one day say that I am Greek citizen. I cannot just say that, I don't want to be Greek anymore. I want to have zero national identity, or I'll take another citizenship. Because obviously, having a national identity carries certain burdens, certain monetary burdens that actually there's no way many governments would like to relinquish, actually, especially in the Greek government's case. Now, the other thing, which is very important, and again was mentioned, is that at some point, we're talking about blockchain security and all the information that basically on the blockchain, or even off blockchain. When we reveal information to someone, that someone can take that information, take it in a memory stick, write it down, do whatever he wants. So again, we have to have a control in terms of who accesses the data, and do we trust that person? And also, do we actually continue to trust that person? So it's actually, let's not forget that information will not always be only on the blockchain or only on the secure data storage systems that we have. It's going to be shared with other people. And if we don't trust these people or these organizations, then actually, it's going to be around till this ceases to exist.
Yeah. Okay, so we only have just a couple minutes left. I feel like we would rob the audience if we didn't quickly go around and answer one specific question, which is, does the application of blockchain technology help enterprises better comply with GDPR, specifically the right to delete? And I know that we could probably talk about that for hours, but I'd like to go around real quick and just get, if you can keep it to 1 or 2 sentences. Do you think it does?
One word, no.
And if it does, how does it, right? Or if it doesn't, how doesn't it? Let's go around real quick and answer that question.
Yeah, I don't believe that blockchain specifically helps with GDPR. It's a giant permanent ledger, which is sort of anti-GDPR. But a lot of the other concepts behind self-sovereign identity and the other pieces of self-sovereign identity do actually help and solve for GDPR. And so when you're talking about the entirety of an end-to-end self-sovereign system, or some of the other systems we've designed up here with similar components to them, you are supporting what GDPR is going after. You're able to meet those GDPR requirements. The blockchain isn't the piece that makes that happen.
Exactly. The way I'd put it is with proper privacy by design, and it goes pretty deep, self-sovereign identity systems will in fact help. They'll help with consent, right to be forgotten, data minimization, pseudonymity, and the overall security. But as I mentioned in an earlier panel, the blockchain roadmap for Austria actually ended up saying, hey, self-sovereign identity is the best way to do that, but only if you design it correctly.
I go back to the original Bitcoin white paper. What is the blockchain? It's really a timestamp server. It stamps events in stone. It happened at this point in time, and so that is really the antithesis of putting identity on a blockchain. Typically, from an engineering perspective, you want to secure the events that occurred off blockchain, and those events in turn secure portions of your identity, portions of attestations and claims, et cetera. And so it's really one or two steps removed from the blockchain itself. So short answer, no, blockchain itself is not beneficial to that.
So GDPR has many aspects apart from the right to be forgotten. When it comes to the right to be forgotten, permission ledgers, you can actually take care of that fairly easily. But more importantly, you have an auditable trail of who accesses your data and when, which is a key part of GDPR. Having ownership of who has access to your data, when, and what do they do with it.
So I think my own point of view on this is that blockchain can be a great ingredient for a great privacy story, but it's not the recipe, right? And so you could also make a privacy disaster with blockchain. So it's all about the recipe. What are you doing? So that's the first point. But I'd say the interesting thing from a blockchain, and there's a direct overlap here, is the original reason for blockchain was to solve the double spend issue. After I give you $10, I shouldn't still have the $10. And where we are today in identities, we have this double spend issue. If I know enough about you, I can be you. Mm-hmm. And that's actually what it can help us solve. What it's going to allow us to do is, what identity is today is all card not present. We can use blockchain to make card present identity. It'll act like a centrifuge and shut down all the sock puppets. That's what it's going to help do.
That's great. All right, and with that, I'd like to thank my panel for talking about
That's awesome.
privacy and security today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.